For those of you that have already joined us this morning while we're waiting for additional folks to log in, we're going to go over a few logistics before we get started. Today we're using Zoom's webinar feature, which means that there's a dedicated Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We're asking that throughout our presentation today and for the discussion after. Please do not submit any questions in the chat function, but rather use that Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And just to practice, for those of you that have already logged in, while we're letting the other last attendees join, please go ahead and open that Q&A tab and post your favorite local species that you think might be found along the Allegheny front. If you're not sure what that might be, any of your favorite wildlife, plant, or tree species will do. And while you're practicing with that Q&A feature, posting your favorite species in the Q&A tab, just a reminder that we are recording today's webinar and we'll be sharing out that recording following today's event. Excellent, some cool species rolling in. Well, I know everyone is excited to hear more about the species found in the Allegheny front landscape, so let's go ahead and get started. Go to the next slide. Again, welcome everyone. I'm Angie Watland, the Central Appalachians Program Director for the Nature Conservancy. And in my nearly 18 years with the Nature Conservancy, I've seen firsthand how so many of our conservation wins have been because of the deep investment in place and through collaboration, passion, and expertise, the incredible people we have in this organization and with our partners. Today, our talk features some of those brilliant conservationists. Dr. Deborah Landau, Director of Ecological Management for our Maryland, DC chapter. George Gress, Fire Specialist and Land Steward for our Pennsylvania and Delaware chapter. And Mike Powell, Director of Land Conservation for our West Virginia chapter. Together, they have an impressive combined 50+ years working on the ground with the Nature Conservancy, and to a large extent in the special landscape we're going to be highlighting today. I'll be providing just a brief overview of the importance of conservation in the Appalachians, and especially in the Allegheny front. And then I'm going to turn it over to these speakers to highlight just a few species, big and small, that help us tell the stories about the importance of the health and function of the Allegheny front ecosystem. Go ahead and next slide, please. In late 2020, the Nature Conservancy launched a Global Focal Places pilot, selecting 4 landscapes that are each globally significant for carbon and biodiversity and have outsized potential to contribute to our organization's ambitious 2030 goals to address the dual crises of rapid climate change and biodiversity loss. The Appalachians are North America's global focal place with some impressive company throughout the globe. You're going to hear more about why that is in just a minute. Here we're going all in as one conservancy, sharing resources and expertise across borders to ensure we can achieve our vision and important goals and can do so much better together. Next slide. So why are the Appalachians so important? Here you see a visual of the temperate deciduous forests, which once extended widely across the globe. In modern times, half of those forests have been cleared, and most of what remains is fragmented by farmlands and development. The largest intact temperate deciduous forests remaining are right here in the Appalachians. Next slide. And they're ancient, among the oldest mountains on Earth. They span over 2,000 miles across 17 states and 3 Canadian provinces. And so There's a nearly unbroken chain of diverse elevations and topography, and there has been quite a bit of time for evolution to create a spectacular diversity of life in the Appalachians. The evolutionary roots of this life can be traced back over 65 million years ago, before the Ice Age, when only forests in what are now China, Japan, small parts of Europe, and the Appalachians survived that glaciation. So this continental connected forested network is not only critical to conserve a future for that spectacular biodiversity, but those same forests are also critical living carbon reserves, storing nearly a quarter of all US above ground carbon. Next slide. And of course, we all know that plants and animals are on the move in response to a changing climate. Squeezed between megacities in the east and agriculture to the west, this Appalachian network of resilient lands and waters is uniquely oriented south to north, which acts as a natural superhighway for species that are seeking refuge for warming temperatures and other climate impacts. Next slide. And so the Appalachians are truly a stronghold for biodiversity, in many cases life that exists nowhere else on Earth. And these lands and waters are so important for over 22 million people that call this region home, being innately tied to the cultures and livelihoods of the local communities and providing staggering ecosystem services like clean air, clean water, recreation, and associated economic benefits. Yet less than a quarter of Appalachian habitats are secured from conversion currently. Next slide. Looking at those biodiverse habitats and high carbon stocks across the Appalachians, TNC scientists have identified the places that are most likely to be resilient in the face of a changing climate, and thus those climate corridors with the greatest need for protection and restoration. When we look across the entire Appalachian connected network, there are just a few places across those 17 states where the flow and natural cover is squeezed into pinch points. In the Appalachians, there are large core protected public lands in the southern and northern portions of that 2,000-mile chain. The Allegheny Front, on the border of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, is centrally located and is one of those critical pinch points where the integrity of the entire connected corridor hinges on conservation of this critical piece of the puzzle. And so we're going all in on this Allegheny Front climate corridor, sharing resources and expertise across those 3 state borders. We have a multi-state team leading a variety of conservation programs, including our first shared land protection position across those 3 states. And this collaboration and increased investment has already generated several opportunities for protection and is advancing how we can more effectively work with our public land partners and private landowners to incentivize climate smart forestry and restoration. TNC also owns several preserves in this landscape. Here you see on the screen 3 iconic examples that are all special for their own reasons. And they are important places to pilot and demonstrate our scalable conservation solutions. Next, you'll hear more about these preserves and the species that inhabit them from our panelists. George Gress, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Angie. So the first species I'm going to talk about is the Allegheny wood rat. The Allegheny wood rat prefers remote rocky outcrops within deciduous forests within the range of the American chestnut. So the term pack rat refers to their caching behavior. They'll often cache herbaceous plants, fungi, excuse me, and man-made objects such as candy wrappers and shotgun shells. They're listed as threatened in Pennsylvania, and they're a priority species in the state's Wildlife Action Plan. Populations occur at several TNC preserves here in Pennsylvania, including sites in Clinton and Perry counties. They're similar to the Norway rat, which is an introduced species and has caused many problems for humans, but the Allegheny wood rat has a rounded nose and ears and fur on the tail. So in cooperation with the Pennsylvania Game Commission, we conducted a survey of wood rats at our Clinton County site in 2018, and we confirmed their presence there. But in 2019, no evidence of the wood rats were found. However, their presence was again confirmed this past summer, and we were actually at the site last Friday to do some monitoring and supplemental feeding, and they actually live on the steepest and rockiest part of the mountain, so their habitats are difficult to get to. The populations have declined for several reasons, one of which is because they're susceptible to parasitism by roundworm that are introduced by raccoons. And historically, they relied heavily on the American chestnut, which declined sharply after the introduction of the blight in the early 1900s. So the American chestnut produces a steady, reliable crop of nuts every year, while oaks, which have essentially replaced chestnuts as the major wildlife food source, are much more sporadic in their nut production. Part of the reason for this is that oaks bloom early in the spring and they're susceptible to late frosts. Chestnuts bloom later in June and July after the risk of frost, and so they produce a much more consistent, reliable crop of nuts every year. So the Nature Conservancy, in cooperation with the American Chestnut Foundation, planted a chestnut orchard in May 2005 as part of an effort to develop a blight-resistant chestnut that can eventually be planted out into our forests. Chestnut trees are fast growing, and as a woodworker, I know that the chestnut wood it's strong, it's relatively lightweight, very easy to work, has a beautiful grain and color, and is pretty rot resistant. So we know there's many species that are interconnected, such as these two, and a decline in one species can have impacts on another and in the long term. So working with partners, we can help to maximize our conservation efforts. The second species I'm going to talk about is the northern saw-whet owl, which is the smallest owl that we have in Pennsylvania. And it's probably also the most common owl, but they're so small and secretive that many people never see them. The breeding range of the saw-whet owl is in the forests of northern PA into the boreal forests of Canada, with limited areas in the higher elevations of the Appalachian Mountains south to Tennessee, and in the west all the way south into the mountains of Mexico. Populations are cyclical in that they follow the populations of small rodents, mostly red-backed voles, and the red-backed voles follow the population or the pine cone production in the boreal forest. So when we have a good pine cone production, we have lots of food for the red-backed voles. When we have lots of red-backed voles, we have lots of food for the saw-whet owls. Saw-whet owls migrate south into the U.S. as far as northern Alabama and Georgia, and it's mostly the females that migrate south. In my spare time, I volunteer for a saw-whet owl banding program that's run by Scott Weidensaul through the Ned Smith Center for Nature and Art here in PA. We have 3 sites where we band owls. There's about 24 banders that are sub-permitted under Scott and about 100 volunteers that man the site from early October up until Thanksgiving. So I've been involved in this project for about 22 years, and we finished this year at 395 owls between the 3 sites, which was our 3rd best in the last 10 years. There are several other sites in PA which are part of a network of over 100 banding sites across northern US and southern Canada through Project OwlNet. And at our 3 sites, we've captured owls that were banded in the northeastern US, all the way from Virginia to Michigan to New England and several Canadian provinces, including Ontario and Quebec. So by banding these birds, we can help to study migration patterns, habitat use, and life history. And we've also done some radiotelemetry, looking at daytime roosting selections and nighttime activity tracking. We've done some geolocator studies looking at the ranges of these birds, as well as feather and tissue sampling for scientific analysis. So one of the interesting technologies that are coming up is the MODIS tags, which is an automated tracking system that contains a network of hundreds of sites where antennas in place, and they can track these birds and even insects automatically as they fly by these towers. So as newer technologies emerge, we'll be able to develop better tracking and monitoring systems for some of these species. And with that, I'll pass it off again.
Thank you, George. So for my favorite species, I'm going to start by also talking about a tree similar to George's chestnut. I'm going to talk about Table Mountain pine. I think this is a really cool tree, and one of the things that makes it so special is it's endemic to the central and southern Appalachians, which means it's not found anywhere else in the world naturally, but parts of our Allegheny front. one of the things that makes this tree so interesting is its pine cones are serotinous, and that means that they're glued shut with sap, and they'll only open if exposed to intense heat, say from a wildfire. And but why would a tree only want to release its seeds during a fire? So what happens after a fire sweeps through an area, especially if it's a light fire that has been occurring at regular intervals, you can picture how suddenly there's a lot less competing vegetation underneath. So lots of areas for a seed to fall without competition. Additionally, the ground is now dark, so it's absorbing more solar radiation. And that's a perfect place for a little seedling to germinate when it's nice and warm. And finally, you've just had this nitrogen pulse into the ground from the fire. So these are the perfect conditions in which this tree is waiting to release its seeds. And historically, we would have had fairly regular fires sweeping through the Allegheny front every 5 or 10 years. Some of these were naturally caused, say, by a lightning strike. But many of these fires were set by indigenous people. They had a really good understanding of the importance of fire and how to use fire, say for hunting or for clearing land or for pest management or to increase berry production. So historically, fires were occurring very regularly throughout the landscape, and we had lots of Table Mountain pine regeneration. But that's ceased. When European settlers arrived about 400 years ago, they drove out many of our indigenous people. But the ones that remained were accused of arson when they tried to set these really important fires. So that really drastically slowed down. But about 100 years ago, we really started suppressing all wildfires that occurred in most of North America. And so the result has been that we've lost this really important ecosystem process. And now we're starting to lose the Table Mountain pines. You can walk along some ridge tops in the Central or Southern Apps and see some big, majestic Table Mountain pines. But you're not going to see any Table Mountain pine regeneration unless you're in an area that's had a wildfire or a controlled burn. And that's one reason that the Nature Conservancy is working really hard to bring fire back to the landscape through very careful controlled burns to bring back these communities. So that's my tree. And then I'm going to switch gears and go from endemic to just this little area to the beaver, which can be found throughout North America. It's as generalist as they come, but I love this guy. So historically, there were hundreds of millions of beaver across the landscape, across all of North America. In fact, beaver had an impact on over 60% of the continent. So pretty amazing. But by the late 1800s, they had been almost completely wiped out, largely by fur traders, but also just to exterminate them. And this had a tremendous impact on how water moved across the landscape. All of these beaver ponds that they were creating were slowing down the flow of water from streams and rivers, causing sediments and nutrients to drop out. So beaver ponds essentially act like water filters. They filter out and store nutrients and pollutants. And that means that the water flowing downstream from a beaver pond is cleaner than the water that went into it. But at the same time, this slowed down water is allowing aquifers to recharge. So thus ensuring that during times of drought, there's water both above and below ground. Lots of people refer to beaver as ecosystem engineers because they create, they modify, and they maintain habitat for ecosystems. And they consequently have a really big impact on the biodiversity of an area, creating more habitat for aquatic organisms like fish or insects, amphibians, birds, mammals, and increasing the biodiversity all around in the dam and in the surrounding area. Beaver dams also result in cooler downstream water temperatures, creating refugia for climate change impacted animals that Angie talked about. So when we removed the beaver, our waterscapes became less complex, less resilient, and less able to support the diverse plant, animal, and human life. But now we're seeing that turn around, and they are starting to return to the landscape. Ironically, today when we clear land for development, we pay millions of dollars to design and install stormwater retention ponds, which are essentially mimicking the role that beaver play much more effectively and for free. So for those reasons and more, I give you the beaver. Thank you.
So in Deborah's presentation, she used the term endemic to describe species that exist in a distinct part of the world and nowhere else. And both of the species I'm going to talk about are endemic to just a handful of counties in West Virginia. And in the case of the northern flying squirrel, one county in Virginia. In West Virginia, we generally refer to this as the West Virginia northern flying squirrel because most of the habitat and most of the individuals occur in the West Virginia portion of its range. The northern flying squirrel is closely related to the southern Blue Ridge form of flying squirrels, where you can find them around the Mount Rogers area. And it's currently thought that there are over at least 25 recognized subspecies of flying squirrels. The northern flying squirrel occupies a small range in the Central Appalachians in Virginia and West Virginia, as I mentioned, and is most common in the Allegheny Mountains from Grant County, West Virginia, southwest to Greenbrier County, including Highland County, Virginia. They're also common in the Allegheny Front area around our Bear Rocks Preserve and Mount Port Crayon Preserves, which are also adjacent to the Dolly Sods and Roaring Plains West wilderness areas. They generally occur at elevations above 3,300 feet, and their current range is nearly the full extent of its historic range. However, that habitat has been fragmented, cut, burned, and otherwise disturbed numerous times. Therefore, its numbers are well below what they would have been historically. The forests that they're most commonly found in have a component of red spruce. They can also have balsam fir and northern hardwood forest associated with their habitat as well. They generally have a well-developed understory, and they occur most commonly where you have that spruce fir forest with a combination of some of the mixed hardwoods, particularly yellow birch. The squirrel generally likes areas where you have a moist forest with widely spaced mature trees and an abundance of dead trees or snags. They like to nest in mature trees where they build their dens, generally out of the bark of the yellow birch tree. They also use small twigs and other materials. And they'll also use nest boxes, and that's one of the ways where you're most likely to see one of these animals because they are most active at night. They are relatively secretive, but our colleagues at the Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Valley National Wildlife Refuge, and the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources have monitoring programs where they use nest boxes that the squirrels will build their home in, and then they're able to go and check on those nest boxes and see if the squirrels are still there. So as I mentioned, they're most active at night, generally when the moonlight is dim or absent, so they like it really dark. And their peak activity probably occurs from sunset to about 2 hours after and until about 1 hour before sunrise. They're generally active throughout the year. Their diet consists largely of fungi and lichen, plus other plant and animal materials such as insects, nuts, buds, seeds, fruits. So they're pretty opportunistic in their diet. But one of the really neat things is they also subsist on a fungi closely related to the red spruce trees. That fungi has been described as a truffle that grows underground, and it has a symbiotic relationship with the squirrel, where it's one of the preferred foods of the squirrel, and it's also the only known dispersal method for that species of mushroom. They spend a considerable amount of their time foraging on the ground. However, they live primarily up in the tree canopy. The species was formerly listed on the U.S. Endangered Species Act, but was delisted in 2013. And following a couple of different lawsuits filed, that endangered status was reinstated for a short period of time, but has been removed again due to recovery of the habitat, primarily the red spruce habitat that the Nature Conservancy and many partners through the Central Appalachian Red Spruce Restoration Initiative have been engaged in throughout the historical range of red spruce trees. The next species I'm going to talk about is the Cheat Mountain salamander, and it also has a close relationship to red spruce forests. So just like the presentations that you heard earlier from Deborah and George, the habitat that these trees provide are actually very important for a whole wide range of different species. So in this case, the red spruce forest and the trees themselves are actually the keystone species with which many of these other species, including these unique endemics, live and find their home. The Cheat Mountain salamander is endemic to the Allegheny Mountains, from Cheat Mountain north to Backbone and Cabin Mountains in Grant, Tucker, Randolph, and Pendleton counties, and Pocahontas County as well. So basically you have 5 counties in West Virginia where this salamander lives, and it's found nowhere else in the world. It has a wide elevational gradient for where it lives, generally ranging between 2,400 and 4,600 feet. And much of the species habitat is found within the Monongahela National Forest. The original range and population of this salamander have been fragmented by many decades of habitat destruction and degradation associated with logging, mining, fire, wildfire activity, and other human events. The current reduced population appears to be stable where the habitat remains relatively undisturbed. The occupied habitat typically consists of very small, fragmented populations that were generally considered or thought to be larger historically. Several of these populations have thought to have actually disappeared or be declining in their populations. The known occupied habitat of this species encompasses less than 10,000 total acres across its range. The global abundance of this is relatively unknown because they spend much of their time underground. Their preferred habitat under red spruce forests include a deep layer of stacked rocks and crevices. So oftentimes when people are out looking for this salamander, they're difficult or nearly impossible to find because they're actually spending their entire lifespan underground. The species may also be at a competitive advantage to other closely related salamanders, such as the mountain dusky and the redback salamander. These other more aggressive salamanders have the potential to encroach upon Cheat Mountain salamander habitat, particularly when habitat alterations result from disturbance or climate change events. The salamander is relatively small. It's only about 12 centimeters long. As you can see, it has a dark dusky color to it and has little gold flecks throughout, which is one of the defining characteristics that make this salamander easily to describe whenever you find it. As I mentioned, the salamander is generally found primarily in red spruce and yellow birch or spruce-dominated forests. They're occasionally collected in mixed deciduous hardwoods where they're thought to have been dominated by red spruce prior to industrial logging of the last century. Many bryophytes and down logs are usually common in their habitat, and they also occur under rocks and other logs during the day, sometimes among wet leaves. They're most active on the forest floor at night, where they may climb lower portions of tree trunks. The eggs have been found in and under rotting logs and under rocks, and they're primarily going to be seen moving around from April through October. Their activity may occur during wet or dry weather, but the salamander is most active at night during humid weather times. The salamander feeds on small terrestrial invertebrates such as mites, springtails, and beetles. And it has been rarely successful crossing disturbed areas such as roadways, rivers, lakes, those types of features form impediments to movement of this feature of this salamander. And the increasing size of rivers or lakes are treated even more as barriers. So these species are oftentimes found in isolated pockets, and it's thought that it could be contributing to declining genetic diversity within the populations. Some of the protection needs that are being implemented to help this salamander and maintain its habitat are to restore appropriate canopy species, especially red spruce, and ground cover where needed. There are also efforts to rejoin the fragmented red spruce forest by creating corridors of spruce forests to connect to larger populations of spruce forests. We do this in a couple of different ways. We plant spruce trees in areas where there's unsuitable habitat. And we also do other forest management and manipulation to enhance spruce forest reaction to be able to become the dominant keystone species in those forests again. We also look at air quality issues to limit acid precipitation. This species is an indicator species and are very vulnerable to acid precipitation. So efforts like the Clean Air Act have greatly increased the habitat they're known in, particularly red spruce forests are growing much better after we've enacted clean air regulations, but also the salamander itself seems to be responding more favorable. Partners monitor all the populations that we know of to ensure that they remain healthy and they are protected, and identify restoration needs that can be put in place to better enhance their habitat. We also work to provide education and outreach to local landowners like ski resorts and vacation rentals throughout their range to assure that visitors avoid activities that may adversely affect the salamander as well. And one of the other things that we're working on is to increase awareness around camping in some of our wild areas throughout their range. One of the things that we've found is that these salamanders are oftentimes utilizing rocks and logs that will be adjacent to campsites. So raising awareness that moving those rocks to build new fire rings and collecting downed wood can actually negatively impact the salamander. So trying to make sure that people are using leave no trace practices and leaving a light hand whenever they're camping or otherwise recreating in Sheep Mountain salamander habitat.
Excellent. Mike, are you closing up here soon? I know we've got some questions rolling in, and I've already got a couple queued up for you all.
Okay.
Great. Well, you all certainly highlighted some of my favorite species, and certainly indicating that larger ecosystem health and sort of the intricate interwoven web of life and how all things are related here in the Central Appalachians. So we're going to now move to our discussion portion. We've been collecting your questions throughout our time together. As a reminder, if you think of any questions, please use that Q&A tab, not the chat feature, to submit them. We've got a large group of folks joining us, which is very exciting, but we won't have time to answer all of them. So we're going to promise you to circle back with more information after this webinar. Our first question actually is for Mike. Could you clarify the range of the northern flying squirrel specifically? Is it found in Pennsylvania?
This specific variety of northern flying squirrel is only in West Virginia and one county in Virginia. So there are flying squirrels some of them are very common, and some of the subspecies are very rare and endemic to just a small area. So there's probably flying squirrels in Pennsylvania, but not the northern flying squirrel.
Yep, I see George in Pennsylvania shaking his head that we do have flying squirrels, just not that particular variety. And
We have the southern flying squirrels here.
very cool. Okay, Deborah, for folks who may have heard that we have too many beavers, is that correct? Do you have any comments on that?
Oh, I do have comments on that. So yes and no. So historically we had maybe 400 million beaver in North America. And today that number is closer to 15 million. So far, far fewer than historical numbers. However, today chances are that that beaver pond is more likely to flood someone's basement or to flood a road. So beaver human interactions, or rather interactions with our structures, are far more common. So beaver are seen more as a nuisance today than they would have historically. Also, we've changed the landscape. So normally, historically, a beaver would set up its pond and maybe eat all the hardwoods in an area and then move on. So that pond would, they're ephemeral habitats. It might persist for 5 or 10 years. But when settlers came in and moved west, they really removed a large component of the conifers, much like the spruce that Mike was talking about. So now when a beaver sets shop, it might have more hardwoods than conifers, and it might be able to stay in that area for a really, really long time. So therefore, impacting and flooding an area far longer than maybe historically it would have. So we're noticing them more. So I don't think we have too many beavers, but they're certainly annoying more people than perhaps they would have historically.
Great, thank you, Deborah. George, question about the habitat requirements that benefit Allegheny wood rats. Is it just the presence of chestnuts?
So since the wood rat's habitat, their home range is fairly small, maybe just a couple acres, they require rock outcrops with lots of little crevices and little holes that they can get back into in the wintertime within unbroken deciduous forests. So the deciduous forest has to have that food source, ideally chestnuts or oaks for winter food stores, and then other soft masts such as blackberry, blueberry, other seed producing plants for the summer food. And so we can either enhance those food plants by management, controlling invasive species, and maintaining some of those tree species that provide food, and then also just kind of keeping those large unbroken tracts of forest so that we can minimize the interactions of the wood rats with raccoons.
Great, thank you, George. Mike, question about that Cheat Mountain salamander photo that was shared. Were those the eggs in that photo? And if so, some comments on how large they are, and if you could tell us a little, do they expand?
Yeah, so those were eggs. That's a pretty unique photograph. We have worked over the years with a professional photographer named Kent Mason. He's volunteered for the Nature Conservancy all over West Virginia and some in Maryland and other places too. He actually captured the image that is my background, which is the Allegheny Front around our Bear Rocks Preserve. But yeah, so those eggs are really tiny. If you remember, I mentioned that the salamander itself is only 12 centimeters long. So if you can imagine, those eggs are probably like 1 to 2 centimeters at most in size.
Great. This question is for all three of you, whoever wants to jump in. Curious about the number of species of trees that we might find in the Allegheny Front. So some folks have certainly heard that maybe we have more tree species here in the Central Appalachians than all of Europe. Anyone have thoughts on the diversity of trees we have here?
So I don't know the answer to the exact question, but one thing I find really interesting about the Allegheny Front focal landscape is that the area in the southern part where I'm most familiar and where I work around Dolly Sods and our Bear Rocks Preserve is probably the most northern location along the Allegheny Front. The species that are assembled there are more likely to be found in the northern US and in Canada than they are anywhere else along the front even. That's largely due to the elevation, that the highest points of the Allegheny Front are also found along that area. So it does make sense that it would have a more northern associated forest.
And I'm going to jump in there and do the flip side of that. And our Finzel Swamp Preserve, we have one of the few populations of large trees, which normally would be found far further south. And that's because of this geologic feature where we have these low, wet, cold areas that we call frost pockets. So very similarly to what Mike said, we can have these species that maybe you'd find in Canada. So as what Angie, as what you said in your introduction, we have that wonderful north to south expanse, as well as that elevation, so that we can have so many more species than you might find elsewhere, which is really exciting.
Great, thank you. This one's a hard one, but I'll let you all get a chance to comment on this. What is the one major change that you think would have the most impact to protecting biodiversity? Is it land acquisition, restoration, education, policy? Obviously, it takes a lot of interventions working in concert, but I think some of our attendees are wondering what you think the highest priority is today.
I don't think we can just address one thing. I think there's a number of things that we need to do, all of which can help, but I don't think there's one strategy that we have that's going to be the silver bullet. I think it's going to take a number of strategies to achieve that.
Yep, I tend to agree. Deborah, Mike, any thoughts there?
No, I definitely agree. I mean, I think that, you know, part of this vision of a resilient and conserved network across the Appalachians is what the Nature Conservancy is really working toward. And we achieve those goals through, you know, a number of different strategies, including land acquisition, improved management on lands that the Nature Conservancy owns, working with agency and private landowners to improve and enhance management on their properties, implementing restoration of degraded sites. So, you know, it's definitely a combination, an all of the above strategy to really protect the biodiversity found here in the Appalachians.
I'll jump on that same bandwagon that it's all of the above. The Nature Conservancy is really science driven, and that's one of the exciting things that when we're doing our restoration activities, we know which trees to plant. We know how much fire to bring back. We know how to restore the hydrology. So it's working with our partners. It's land acquisition, and it's restoring these landscapes in the best manner possible.
Excellent. George or others, jump in. James joined us and said he was hiking in Pennsylvania State Forest a month ago and saw 3 good-sized American chestnuts. He's curious, are these survivors of the blight or some sort of experimental planting?
So it could be either. There are a number of chestnut trees that persist as stump sprouts from historic trees. So the stump sprouts will sprout up. They'll get to maybe 6-7 inches in diameter if they're lucky, and then they'll succumb to the blight. So a lot of times these are just temporary trees that will eventually wink out. But the American Chestnut Foundation is working on a couple different avenues of approach for developing a blight-resistant chestnut tree. So hopefully we'll be able to make that happen in the next decade or so.
Excellent. We have a question from Amy, who says she has a family farm with several endangered special species of concern found on the property. What resources are there to assist with habitat management on private land? So I'll jump in and say that it certainly depends on the state, but there are a wealth of resources with state and federal partners, as well as with your local chapter at the Nature Conservancy that can really think about incentives and resources to, again, manage and improve habitat, especially if there are some rare species and really healthy habitats on that land. Anyone else want to comment for Amy?
I'm a big fan of reaching out to your local Forest Service county agents. If you have land, you really should have a management plan for that property. And I find that your local agents are so knowledgeable and so helpful at putting together a plan that meets your wishes as well as the best interest of the land. And who knows, you might be eligible for your land might be appropriate for putting a conservation easement on it, which would help with your tax burden. So lots of great programs out there to help you protect the land, even if you're hanging on to it.
Great, thank you. Mike, can you connect the dots between saving one salamander and protecting a whole tract of land?
That's a difficult one. So I think that, a lot of the work that we do is not single species focused, but is really habitat focused. And so by protecting, improving, and restoring the habitat, we actually benefit a whole host of species. And I think that's where we do our best work, is looking at the landscape as a whole, finding those places that are the most important for resilience and connectivity, and protecting the known biodiversity that is within those areas. And generally, we get good results from a whole wide range of species through that approach.
Excellent. And one more question for you, Mike, and it's the final question we have time for today. Is the Dolly Sods Wilderness considered within the Allegheny Front? I know it's one of my favorite places to hike and backpack.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So when we looked at the boundaries of the Allegheny Front critical focal landscape, part of the goal was to connect these two large national forest areas, the Monongahela National Forest in the south and the Allegheny National Forest in the north. And by doing that, we were real strategic at drawing the lines for the Allegheny Front really tight to include the most resilient places in between those two entities. When you look at the biophysical setting of the Allegheny Front, it actually extends all the way down to Seneca Rocks, for those that are familiar with that part of West Virginia. However, the focal area that we agreed to work in is just slightly north of that, and really begins in the very northern part of the Dolly Sods Wilderness area.
Great. I hope all of you have been inspired to visit some of these special places and look for these species yourselves. Again, thank you to our featured speakers, Deborah, George, and Mike. I know I would love, for one, to listen and chat with you all for many more hours about the natural history of the species on the Allegheny Front. This webinar was a collaborative achievement from our Maryland, DC, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and West Virginia chapters. So on behalf of this broad group of TNC staffers, we thank you all for attending and supporting the Nature Conservancy's work in the Appalachians. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar was recorded, so please watch your email for recording to arrive, and you're welcome to view and share that out to others. And I encourage you to visit the Species of the Allegheny Front website on nature.org/Allegheny Front Species. I think they're going to locate that in the chat, that link. Please reach out to your local chapter if you want more information on anything you've learned today. We're always happy to share more about this exciting landscape and our work here. Hope you have a wonderful day.